G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Sunday the 29th of October, just getting ready to record the Mindfield.
Perhaps never before has the name of this show, The Mindfield, been more apt. But welcome to it as we try to negotiate the ethical and moral dilemmas of modern life. Waleed Ali is my name. Scott Stevens is my co-host. Scott, today we're throwing out the script. This is a show that is unlike any other. We're changing the format. We're basically cowering and handing things over to guests in a moment, aren't we?
Yes, exactly right. I'm very, very happy, in fact, to be the guest on this particular show. No, but I realize, Waleed, we've been going for nearly 3 years now, and I realize that you've had a kind of secret agenda the entire time to get me thinking and talking more about sport. I realize that, and you've got to know that with every fiber of my being, I've been resisting that. In fact, it's my goal in life to think and reflect and give as little attention as possible to sport. But, damn it, sport increasingly is the arena in which I think some of our most interesting political and moral questions are being thrown up. Now, the thing that immediately comes to mind, I suppose, is the Take a Knee protest in the U.S. What's so interesting about that is the NFL has so successfully kept the politics of race at bay for decades and decades and decades. And now here, in the middle of NFL sporting stadiums, this protest is being enacted. A bit closer to home, though, we've had another incident, which I think it exemplifies in so many ways not just a particular issue that we've been dying to discuss, but also, I think, the confusion, the fraught nature of the language, the terminology, the moral concepts that we use in which to discuss it. Very recently, the AFL decided not to allow trans woman Hannah Mouncey to play in the AFLW competition. It provided some very clear reasons for that. It generated a divided and, as one would expect, quite a fraught response. But it seems to me that this particular issue, a very simple decision, I should say a decision that was met with extraordinary grace on the part of Hannah herself, really highlights, I think, so much of the confusion, the inarticulacy that characterizes public debate whenever that debate comes around to talking about gender. And so it seems to me that here we are in this show, caught in the middle, and I have no doubt that you'll expand these concepts, and our guests will expand these concepts still, but the three concepts that I guess strike me are gender is here caught between three rival notions, one of identity, another of biology, and another of power. And as soon as you shift towards any of those three terms, it seems that the vernacular changes, the moral calculus changes, and the possibility of an appropriate political response changes as well.
All right, so perhaps some context. Hannah Mouncey is a trans woman who transitioned 2 years ago. She is, 25, I think? Anyway, something around that age. So she'd spent most of her life biologically being male. I think it represented Australia in handball.
That's right.
As a male. So had been an elite athlete as a male.
Was captain of the team, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, and then the AFLW, so this is the new women's competition. The AFL was in this position of trying to decide whether she could nominate for the draft. They made an interesting decision, actually. They said, no, not this year. You're eligible to apply next year. It felt a little bit like they were saying, we don't know how to make this decision yet. And yet she's allowed to play in lower leagues, which is a bit of an anomaly. I can only assume, and this is my presumption, that their reasoning on that is we want to preserve the competitive integrity, I guess, of the AFLW. At lower leagues, that's not as big a concern. So if there is an unfair biological advantage here, it's better that that's visited upon lower leagues than upon the elite competition. But that's just me kind of trying to read their mind a little bit. We don't know the data they looked at to try to figure this out. We really don't know a lot about how exactly they made that decision. We do know that Hannah Mouncey has said publicly, whether this is what is in her heart of hearts or not, she said publicly that she felt that the process was one that did keep her dignity and that took her seriously and so on. So that's the background here. I think what is interesting, though, is I think it raises interesting questions about precisely what the point of women's sport is. And when we start playing when we start trying to come to grips with questions of gender, I think what's brought to light is that distinction you partly identified is that the difference between biology and identity. So when we talk about gender now in public discourse, I would contend that it is, generally speaking, an identity-based notion. Sport has never really been divided up on identity lines before. It's been divided up on lines of sex. It's been divided up on lines of biology before. And I think that distinction has been suddenly brought into view in a way that I don't think people were really anticipating would happen, because we're not used to having conversations about it in quite that way. And I know the Olympic movement has had to confront questions like that, and we've got certain biological ways of trying to determine eligibility. And we should say Hannah Mounty would actually have been eligible to be in the Olympics as a woman based on testosterone levels or whatever it is they use to decide. But I do think it is interesting that we've become so used to talking about this through an identity prism that suddenly when a biological prism is thrown up in front of us, it seemed to me anyway, we're not really sure exactly how it is we should respond. And the AFL has found itself accused from all kinds of directions on this, I think because those two worlds have come together and if not collided, then at least not fit nicely in the way that a jigsaw puzzle would. So for me anyway, Scott, you can add something briefly if you like, but for me they're the contours of it. Is there anything else that I've missed there, just briefly?
No, I want to get to our guests because I am I look at there are all sorts of questions that we have, I think, become accustomed to asking about the relationship between, for instance, biology and culture, social conceptions of gender. This is something that I've been historically quite used to. It's something that I find myself overwhelmingly convinced by. This then becomes a series of questions that I am, just to be perfectly frank with you, I am desperate to be schooled in.
Okay, yeah, and I think we're a bit the same way. I think very often we just pretend we know about stuff on this show. I think we've got to a point where we can't really pretend no longer. So we're throwing out the normal format. We're actually I'm speaking for you.
Right. Okay.
So what we're going to do today is we're actually going to have two guests to try to walk us through this, because each, I suppose, brings unique qualifications to how an issue like this plays out, and can kind of get our thinking straight on how it is that we might conceptually approach the kind of conundrums that this throws up. So you are on the Mindfield. You can listen to the show anytime on the ABC Listen app. You can listen to us on the radio, of course, as you may be doing right now, or you can subscribe to our podcast wherever it is that you do such things. So, Scott, tell us about our double-barreled guest.
Our double-barreled guest. And in fact, this is a genuinely interstate program. Usually, I mean, everyone knows I'm in Brisbane, Leeds, and Melbourne, but both of our guests are tucked into a little TARDIS in Sydney, and I'm feeling incredibly on the outer here. I'm wishing I was there with you both. Our guests are Raewyn Connell. She is Professor Emerita at the University of Sydney, one of the world's most distinguished researchers and social theorists, and it's a particular pleasure to have her on the show. Also, Bronwyn Winter. Bronwyn is Associate Professor in European Studies and International Studies at the University of Sydney. Thank you both for joining us on the show.
Hello. Glad to be here.
So look, to my mind, the questions that this throws up far outstrip sport. But, try as I might, you can't remove the dimension of sport entirely out of this particular equation. So I'm just wondering, I'm curious what you both made of the AFL's decision.
Well, I'll sort of jump in first because I'd like to throw this conversation in a slightly different direction. I'm thinking, what do the women think? I have not been able to find anything online or on radio or anything about what the women in this team think, whatever their views are. No one seems to be talking to them. And I'm also thinking that, my God, these poor women, they have struggled and struggled and struggled to get recognised as elite athletes. They're still grossly underpaid. I think I read something last year like the AFLW was earning, what, a hundredth of what the men earn. The Matildas 2 decades ago had to do a nude calendar to fundraise to be able to play their sport. And I mean, we're not on a level playing field. We're nowhere near being on a level playing field. And I'm thinking these poor women, now they have another problem to deal with. Now, maybe it shouldn't be posed in terms of problem, but the thing is, you raised the question before about interrogating women's sport and what do we mean by women's sport and what do we want from women's sport. Well, maybe we should ask about what we want from men's sport first. And we know why this is so unequal.
Yeah, well, can I...
If we
sorry, Raewyn, go on.
Yeah.
Coming back to what was raised right at the start, the idea that we're inarticulate in discussing these things. In fact, we live in a culture that's really quite insistent about gender. It's the first thing we ask about a new baby. We put boys and girls in different...
I thought we asked about the sex. We seem to have sort of, gender has become this sort of euphemism for everything. It can mean, male domination, it can mean women, it can mean men, it can mean transgender, and suddenly we now, we don't talk about sex anymore, we talk about gender, and we seem to have conflated those two terms. Sorry to interrupt you, Raywin, but I just wanted to jump in on that. I'm getting very annoyed about this.
Yeah. And that is a constant confusion. That's perfectly true. Anyway, one of the things that we are very much insistent on, it seems collectively, is the gender of sport, and especially contact sports, competitive war-type sports like football, which are, of course, gendered masculine. So the whole apparatus of big money commercial televised sport has grown up around representations of masculinity. And that's created an extraordinarily strongly gendered field for women's sports to move into.
I will jump in though and say a lot of my friends, my lesbian friends, I must add, who really like AFL, will swear that AFL is completely different. It's a completely different type of sport than rugby, which is far more aggressive. So, there are football aficionados who make quite a lot of distinctions between the level of, masculinity involved in these sports and the level of aggression.
That's absolutely right. And if you bring in gridiron, soccer, you've got a whole spectrum of these things.
Absolutely.
And yet, I think this is the cultural meaning of football in general.
Yeah.
That it's a site for the display of a certain kind of physical masculinity.
Indeed.
And that's where a lot of the tension around the presence of women and the definition of women's sport comes in.
But do you think that's what's really at play in an instance like this, where you have a women's league that's being created? One of the ideas behind the creation of that women's league, and one of the reasons that was so celebrated, particularly by women who were going to these games and celebrating these games quite publicly, one of the ideas is that it expands the notions of femininity that are on offer to young girls growing up.
Femininity? Are we really going there?
Well, if we're going to talk about masculinity, I'm not sure what to call the first, but I'm saying if one of the reasons that this was celebrated was it was trying to break down the idea that football is a thing that only men do and only men can do. But so that it was gendered in that way. That becomes a gender discussion. But when it becomes a question of whether trans athletes should be admitted to play in a sport like that, does it become less a gender discussion and more of a sex discussion? Raywin, I'll start with you.
Well, I don't think you can easily separate, the social, the cultural, the biological. Actually, you've got to think about the relationships between them.
Sure.
About the way, for instance, certain kinds of bodies become symbols of the social position of men or the social position of women or particular groups of them. So I get very frustrated when we're thrown back suddenly into a nature-nurture kind of contestation, and it seems to me that actually misunderstands what gender, as a whole process is about, which is to me about the relationship between bodies and social processes, between, if you like to put it that way, between biology and culture, about how those are related in our social activities and in our institutions. So, to me, the strategic questions are not what's the truth of any individual's gender or sex, but how is the institution working and what kind of effects is that producing in our human life?
Oh, indeed. Speaking of institutions, I think we still live in one that's called male domination or patriarchy or whatever you want to call it. And if we're thinking in terms of, well, radical feminism, particularly radical feminism and radical lesbianism, posited that we really wanted to move beyond gender binaries. We wanted to get rid of gender because it was oppressive, particularly to women, but also to a lot of men. And what I'm concerned about in the sorts of conversations we're having at the moment.
Okay, we're on the upload limit. Back immediately.